Hello everyone. As you may have gathered in talking to me, my period of study is primarily before 1920. I have written about children's clothes since then, but the mass of the data and the sources I've studied relate to this period. And today I'll be presenting some material that I've gathered since my PhD in the related book, which is boys' clothes, and I'll be talking about families and family consumption. And I'll also outline one of the methodologies I've used to get around some of the problems. And I think it's very interesting that Ben's raising methodological problems, because I think it's very important to be aware that there are methodological problems, even with something as recent as the 19th century. And we have to kind of stop ourselves from overgeneralizing in them. Anyway, so I'm going to start with an overview of the role of mothers in providing children's clothing in a society that was fixated on consumption as a sign of social status, but also concerned about correct methods of mothering. And the reasons for this concern shift over the period. By 1914, we're starting to see a discourse around the future of the race. That's to say, the future of the British population and concerns about child mortality and child sickness. And that then sparks off a whole slew of texts trying to advise working class families how to raise their children, which aren't necessarily terribly either realistic or helpful. So I'm going to address those texts. And I should just put out here right now the fact that even as late as 1914, Britain was 90% working class. So I just want you to hold that fact in your mind. When I first read it, my brain went, what? Because it's very easy to study sources aimed at the middle classes, the upper middle classes, and think, it's fine, this relates, we know where we are, it relates to stuff in museums, and then you step back and go, oh, but that was 10% of the population. So a lot of my research over the last 20 years has been trying to uncover the practices of the majority of the population, the 90%. Children's attitudes to clothing in 19th century autobiographies. Now, again, this is a tempting set of sources to use, but my investigations have shown that autobiographies can be problematic for several reasons. And the extent to which clothing practices reflected autobiographies will be evaluated through quantitative analysis. Don't be worried, it's quantitative analysis for beginners. I barely passed my arithmetic grade. And this, for me, has been a way of accessing the lived experiences of children who left no written record, which of course is the vast majority of children before 1940. And it's also a way of addressing the gap between the child's experience as a child and the moment when the autobiography is being written down, which is inevitably at least 10 years later. And that's only the first of several problems around autobiographies. Now, in the 1880s, you see these very, very polarized discourses. On the one hand, you have fashion magazines like Myra's Mid-Monthly magazine, which was basically like children's Vogue. It was a dressmaking magazine, but focusing on children's clothes. It ran for only a couple of years, from 1880 to 1882. And it comes out the statements like this: the boys are 2 or 3, there are nice little indoor dresses of zephyr, which is like wool, and lovely frocks of muslin and embroidery, with all the adornments of finely gauged plastrons, and white sashes of folded surah, and exquisite coats of brochet with deep embroidery on the cape, for wearing when sitting or driving with mamma. So this is a child's dress made out of fine cotton and 3 or 4 different kinds of silk, that's surah and brochet and satin. And when driving, that's driving in the carriage, where the child is dressed in its best to be seen in public with Mama, or sitting in the drawing room when Mama's friends come to call. So this is the child as fashion accessory. And this is an actual dress worn by a boy born in 1881, and yes, it is made of red silk satin. But then you have this countervailing comment. Most of our richest and most cultivated people nowadays dress their children in plain cottons, ginghams and muslins in summer. These sensible people aim to bring their children up to have a refined and quiet taste. And this is coming less from a kind of childhood and childcare perspective, and actually more from a dress reform perspective, which was very, very strong in Britain in the late 19th century. So it's, as this flags up, it's not only bringing children up, it's what you're bringing them up as. Text for working class mothers. Now, I found this journal incredibly interesting. The Cooperative News was a subscription journal for members of the British cooperative societies. You would normally join your own branch. It would be the Winchester Cooperative Society or the Stockport Cooperative Society. And the people who joined these cooperative societies were typically working class, but kind of the more prosperous end of the working class, who would band together and join this cooperative society so that they could buy domestic goods and food and clothing at a fair price, but these goods were produced under fair trade conditions. So there's a lot of discussion in there about mutual aid. And the Woman's Corner articles are really interesting because in them you have someone who presents herself as a working class woman. She may not have been, talking to other working class women about ways that they could do things that would help them, help their budgets and help their children. And here Amy Sharp is talking about the issue of dressing children fashionably, but in a way that damages their health, so that a child with a short dress, short socks, and bare legs, which was actually in the 19th century quite typical. Then she goes on to say that you need to budget for clothing, and you can do this by buying good quality materials, cutting up your own clothes and remaking them for your child, which is not always an actual saving. But she's trying to put herself into the shoes of the cash-strapped mother, but also advocating for the health of the children. Now, here is the other kind of advice to working class mothers by a middle class woman who was closely, Margaret Singh, who was closely associated with the dress reform movement at Glasgow School of Art. And she wrote a whole series of books on dressing children and dressing infants. And it's interesting because it's really quite explicit in that she says, having found garments comfortable, free and healthy for children, educating parents, that's the classes, common sense would seem to dictate that these lines should be commended to parents of the less enlightened. So we know how to do things, and now we're going to tell working class mothers how to do things. And she says, perhaps the jersey is, that's a knitted sweater, is of chief importance to the growing child. The jersey is better for boys than the waistcoat. Boys grow quickly in breadth of chest, and the waistcoat is apt to cut them across while the jersey is loose and elastic. And the picture on the left shows another, bigger bunch of the jersey, which is unisex, because you could have one jersey and it could be worn by both a boy and a girl. So, pragmatically, she seems like a case to make, that this is a garment that's comfortable, it's stretchy, so you don't have to buy a new one so often, and you can hand it from brother to sister and back again. But she then goes on to talk about pinafores, and I'll be using these pinafores as the case study in this presentation. White pinafores, must they always be white? Could not our English children wear coloured pinafores at school, and she then refers to perhaps in France, where children used to wear dark-coloured overalls to school. The mother would be saved the washing of at least 2 pinafores for every child per week, while the school would benefit by the bright patches of colour. Now, this seems on the face of it to be a good point, you know, that if you send your child to school in an overall over its clothes, make it a coloured one, because then you won't have to wash and iron it so often. However, the sources I've looked at shows that in saying this, she revealed how little she understood what was actually in working class women's minds. So, autobiographies on girls' clothing, resistance. Now, these 2 passages are ones that you find again and again. When Raverack is particularly well known in that she did a very often reprinted autobiography called Period Piece. However, problems and sources. She wrote it down, of course, decades after the event. I mean, she's writing about the 1890s and 1900s, and it was published in 1952. So by the time she published her memoirs, the adults featured in her memoirs would have been long dead. She was also from a very particular upper-class intellectual family. She was granddaughter of Charles Darwin. So that her family were not even typical of middle-class behaviour. Faith Osgoody is a bit different in that she wrote a shorter memoir that was not for formal publication and that was collected by John Burnett in Destiny Obscure. But she's still writing considerably after the period that she's describing. And both of these writers talk about the discomfort of clothing and the way that this was imposed by adults on children. And wherever here is talking about corsets, in particular discomfort, restraint, and pain. We knew it was hopeless, we were outflanked on every side, but we did rebel against states, corsets. And then Faith Osgoody writes about how differently children were dressed. The dresses were longer than grown-ups wear today. If we showed our knees, we were in trouble. We always wore white pinafores. And then she talks about other children's understanding of clothing standards and how the better off children would make fun of her and her siblings because they didn't have as many new clothes as they did. So this is a very interesting perspective on clothing as a reflection of social status within the childhood peer group. Autobiographies about boys' clothing. Now, I found this passage extraordinarily interesting because it pointed to something that I hadn't come across in any other text. And again, it is writing, it's published considerably later than he's talking about. But anyway, Cecil Roth, who lived in London, says that the boys' outfitters' shops, Isaac Walton, John Baker, Man and Boyd, sold little suits which, among those whose parents could afford them, amounted to a uniform. A tweed or serge Norfolk jacket up and right up to the throat, surmounted by a huge white eating collar, celluloid, that's plastic for weekdays, starched linen for Sundays. The boys who didn't have Norfolk jackets usually had coloured blouses plus jerseys in the winter. Such boys, generally speaking, wore shorts, as distinct from button-up knee breeches that went with the Norfolk jacket. Now, this is really important because he's identified jerseys as the garment that were worn by the less well-off boys in his school who didn't have Norfolk jackets matching their breeches. And then another testimony from Edward Brown, which again is quite rare but very interesting, because he talks about his mother having been a servant and receiving parcels of clothes from the family, the upper middle class family that she used to work for. one of the things, she actually said to me, "You're going to wear this, not on Sunday, but to school." And it was a suit which caused a great deal of mortification. It was a coloured velvet, gold in colour, and beautifully made, but it stood out against the drab cloth suits of my associates in quite a startling way. So the problem with this suit was not that it wasn't well made, not that it wasn't high in status, it was both, but it was wrong in the context of the school playground that Edward Brown attended. So you have this kind of micro distinction going on within the schoolyard. Which brings me to school group photographs. Now, early on in my PhD, I realised I wanted to use photographs of children, and there then followed a very frustrating period where I tried to find dated, not, oh, we think this is 18 whatever, but actually dated photographs of children. And eventually I found some school group photographs in various archives. And I'll just say what these are not. We have the name of the school, we have the place at the school, which you can use as a proxy for the income levels of families. We lived in this area in Lamb, it was not a particularly rich area. We have the date. We do not have the age of the boys or the class, a little bit of class on the label front. However, we can infer the age of the boys because in British schools in the 1890s, there were three divisions. There was infants, which was 4-ish to 8-ish, where the classes were mixed and you had women teachers. You then had older girls and older boys. And since these children are in a single-sex group with a male teacher, they are older boys, so they're aged 9 up to 11, which would be the school-leaving age. And what I found really interesting about these photographs is that when you look closely, you can actually start to distinguish different kinds of garments that they're wearing. This one's wearing long trousers, this one's wearing knee breeches buttoned at the knee, this one's wearing long trousers, this one's wearing shorts. You can start to see their jackets. This is like a suit jacket, this is a Norfolk jacket, this is a sailor jacket, this is another Norfolk jacket, and this one's a suit jacket worn over a jersey, and here we have a suit jacket over a jersey. So you can actually start to see what they're wearing. What did I do with this information? Well, I actually tabulated it, and I will talk about this now, and I'll go back to the girls. So that I set up a database with the row, is the photo, the date, 1896, and I just went through and went, okay, Norfolk, 1, 2, that's actually difficult to complete. Sailor, 1, 2, Jersey, 1, 2, lounge, that's suit jacket. And because I saw so many of jerseys and jackets rather than shirts and jackets, I had a separate column for that, and a separate column for collars, because collars pop up in all sorts of situations. And I did that with dozens of photographs, which gave me a huge number of data points where I could start to look at what was being worn at what date. And I'm going to go back to girls' schools. Yeah. So, girls' schools, pinafores. And remember that Margaret Singh talked about how coloured pinafores were so much better and more practical than white pinafores. Well, what you see in the autobiographical records is that the white pinafore was a really important marker of status amongst the poorest. This came up in an oral history by Anna Davy, that a little girl was lent a white pinafore so she'd look as good as anyone else. And this woman, writing about her own childhood in a village school where she was middle class but hard up, and she and her sister had white pinafores, everybody else was poorer and they had coloured pinafores. And then this girl, who is from a working class family but went to a more middle class school on scholarship, and she had to wear a white pinafore as a sign of respectability. And then when she went to school in her white pinafore, she was told by the teacher that she shouldn't be wearing a white pinafore because that wasn't what was done in that school. And another woman saying the same thing, that in her school in the north of England, the girls didn't wear pinafores because their dresses were good enough to be seen without a pinafore over the top. And no more clogs, that's shoes with wooden soles as opposed to shoes with leather soles, because of course wooden clogs would be much more hard wearing. And in this photograph, which is slightly blurry, you can see some of the girls are wearing blouses and skirts, some of them are wearing dresses and pinafores, and one or two of them, I think it's this one, if you look closely, you can see that the dress itself looks as if it's torn, and so the pinafore is actually hiding that. And what I found really interesting looking at more and more of these images and these infants was that I started to realise that there was a habitus within schools of what it was and wasn't thought suitable to wear at different schools and also in different age ranges. And so that here you see in this infants group, nearly all the little boys are wearing sailors' tops, and the ones who aren't are wearing a blouse, which is shaped similarly and has a different collar. And most of the girls are wearing these wide dresses with pinafores. And the little boys, some of them have white frilly collars, that one over there, on top of their sailor jacket. And I think that relates to the occasion being quantitative methodology, we've taken through. So, what can we do with this? Well, you can count what they're wearing, but how do we understand what it means? Well, the other thing I did in my PhD was I worked out the actual cost of typical garments, which would be a sailor suit, as a proportion of wages, using census data as my baseline for wages. And for that, I use mail order catalogues, and there are many if you know where to look. And what's really interesting is when you look at these at first, you might look at this and go, oh, okay, it's a law for, oh, here we go. A little boy's suit for 10.6, or here's one for 5 shillings. That doesn't sound like very much. But if you think that the household income might be 20 shillings for working class family, 30 shillings for artisan, 50 shillings for clerical workers, that's a lot of money. And 10.6, you can actually get an adult woman's coat and skirt for 10.6 at that period. So that actually makes you stop and think about the cost of clothing. Having said that, when I looked at other catalogues, I could see that the price of clothing was going down over the period from 1850 to 1900. So that clothing was becoming more affordable. Retail catalogues for little girls. This is the same firm in Glasgow. And again, here what interested me is that the actual garments themselves are not that expensive, maybe 2 shillings and threepence, but the outfit as a whole would still represent quite an outlay, because you wouldn't just buy the dress, you would also have to have a set of combinations, maybe a support bodice, maybe a slip, some stockings, a pair of shoes, and then for adding the pinafore on top, that is another element of expenditure. So these are some of the sources I've used. I did actually have a photograph of a pinafore from Bethnal Green, which fortunately has not made it into the presentation. But this is where I am with this. I have published it. I'm very happy to respond to any questions or comments on this material.